In 1987, a teenager connected a wire to a wall and entered a world that no longer exists. Before search engines, before social media, before most people had even heard the word internet, there was another digital world. A world built from telephone wires, the screech of modems, and the glow of cathode ray tubes in darkened bedrooms. It was called the modem world. For about 15 years, millions of people lived inside it, and almost no one today knows it existed. The modem world ran on a simple idea. If two computers both had a modem and a telephone, they could talk to each other. One computer would call the other, the modem would translate digital data into audio tones, and for a few minutes or a few hours, a connection would exist. No central servers, no global network, just a direct line and a community built around it. Connection sound lasted 8 seconds. After it, there was silence. Then the world opened up. The systems at the centre of this world were called bulletin board systems. The name came from the physical cork boards in school hallways, places where people posted notes and others read them later. A digital bulletin board worked the same way. One person hosted it on their own computer, usually in a spare bedroom or a basement. Others would dial in and leave messages, download files, and read what others had written. Simple, local, entirely human. The first digital bulletin board appeared in February 1978 in Chicago during one of the worst blizzards in the city's history. Two hobbyists were snowed in, unable to deliver their computer club newsletter in person. They decided to post it online instead. Within months, hundreds of similar boards had appeared across North America. By the mid-1980s, there were tens of thousands of them. By the early 1990s, there were more than 50,000 active boards worldwide. Each board was its own thing. A person called a sysop, short for system operator, would choose a theme, write the rules, and manage everything themselves. Some boards were dedicated to a single topic: vintage cars, science fiction, ham radio, local politics, chess. Others were general and welcomed anyone. The sysop was the architect, the moderator, the community manager, and the librarian all at once. Without them, nothing worked. Most boards were free. The only cost was a long-distance phone call that could run for hours. Phone bills were a real concern in the modem world. Calling a board in your own city cost almost nothing. Calling 1-3 states away could cost $1 a minute, and sessions lasted hours. Some users ran up hundreds of dollars a month chasing the best boards. Parents found the bills. Arguments followed. Accounts were terminated. It was a kind of love tax, the price of reaching conversations that existed nowhere else. Despite the costs, the boards grew, because what they offered was unlike anything else. Before the modem world, if you loved medieval history or astrophysics or rare jazz recordings, your options were limited to whoever happened to live nearby. The board changed that. Suddenly you could correspond with someone across the country who shared your exact specific, otherwise unshareable enthusiasm. The relief of being understood, of finally finding people like you, was worth any phone bill. You would dial in, wait for the handshake, and see 20 new messages waiting. That was enough. The interface was entirely text. No images, no colour in most cases, just white characters on a black screen. Lines of ASCII characters, the 128 symbols available in the basic computing alphabet, could be arranged into surprisingly sophisticated art, elaborate portraits, animated logos, maps and diagrams, an entire aesthetic of characters repurposed into imagery that no graphical tool could produce. This was a medium that made artists out of typists. Navigation worked through numbered menus. You pressed a key to read messages. You pressed another to post your own. You pressed another to download files. Each board had a slightly different layout, a slightly different personality. Learning a new board was like learning the layout of a new house. Regular visitors developed a kind of muscle memory for the menus they navigated every night, moving through the system faster than a stranger ever could. The download libraries were the treasure rooms. sysops curated collections of software, games, images and documents that users could pull down through the modem at the speed of a slow trickle. A single game might take 45 minutes to download, but the anticipation of waiting for a file to arrive, watching the progress counter tick upward, had a particular quality: focused, quiet, patient, entirely different from the instant availability we have now. The speed of a modem connection was measured in a unit called baud rate. Most boards in the early days ran at 1200 baud. That was considered fast. A full-length novel would take nearly 3 hours to transmit at that speed. Users learned to appreciate brevity. The culture of the modem world valued precise, considered writing. Not because anyone mandated it, but because every extra word cost a little more time, and time was the currency everyone spent. By the late 1980s, network echoes had begun to appear. A message posted on a board in Seattle could be copied overnight to a board in Miami and then to one in Toronto. These automated relay chains created the first experience of something like a global conversation, but it moved in slow motion. 24 hours for a reply, sometimes 48. The patience required was remarkable, and people developed it because the alternative was silence. The largest relay networks eventually spanned continents. Volunteer administrators ran the routing systems from their own homes, staying up late to ensure their node was processing and forwarding traffic correctly. There was no company behind it, no funding, no central authority, just a web of individual people who had decided independently that this was worth doing. The entire global relay ran on personal commitment and nothing else. Somewhere in this network, for the first time in history, someone who was entirely alone was not. This was the part that changed people. The modem world was the first place where someone in a remote town could find others who understood their life, not just their hobbies, their actual experience of being alive. Lonely teenagers found peers. Isolated adults found colleagues. People going through the same obscure illness found others who knew exactly what it felt like. Long before the language for these things existed, the modem world built support structures around them. Friendships formed across thousands of miles that lasted decades. Some became romances. Some became marriages. People who met through the static of a dial-up connection in 1989 are still in each other's lives today. What looked, from the outside, like a teenager staring at a glowing screen late at night was often something more significant. A person finding, for the first time, a community that accepted them completely. Networks emerged around every kind of human experience. The modem world was not one community. It was hundreds of thousands of communities running in parallel, each with its own culture and history. A researcher who wanted to understand its full scope today would need to reconstruct it from fragments. Scattered backups, personal memories, and the occasional surviving archive, because almost none of it was deliberately documented at the time. In the late 1980s, a network of bulletin boards appeared that was built specifically for Black Americans. It carried discussions that were rarely welcomed in the predominantly white spaces of the broader modern world. Black history, Black literature, Black community news, experiences of racism, strategies for navigating a world that often preferred to ignore these conversations. It was a digital home for a community that had been underserved by every mainstream medium before it. Other networks offered something similar for gay and lesbian users at a moment when that identity was still criminalized in many states and widely stigmatized everywhere. Before any mainstream publication would acknowledge that such people existed online, these boards had active daily conversations. People came out in those message threads. People asked questions they had never been able to ask before. The safety of the text-only anonymous screen made possible what face-to-face conversation could not. Some of these communities were the only safe spaces their members had ever known. That was not a small thing. A dedicated bulletin board network carried medical information, legal resources, and personal support during the AIDS crisis at its height. Patients were often isolated, denied information, and turned away by institutions meant to help them. Into this void came information distributed through modems. People with no other way to find current, accurate guidance found it through a phone line. In some cases, the information they downloaded quite literally saved their lives. These communities existed in a kind of deliberate obscurity. Their members were not advertising their presence. The boards were listed on known directories but rarely promoted. The people who found them were often the people who most urgently needed to. Word of mouth spread through the channels of the community itself. A friend would pass a phone number along. You would dial. You would find yourself, without warning, in the middle of a conversation that had been going on for years. A separate subculture operated by entirely different rules. Boards dedicated to technical exploration ran on the fringes of everything else. Rarely listed, rarely discussed openly, accessible only to those who knew where to look. These boards carried a culture of curiosity about systems that were designed to be opaque. The people there were not, for the most part, trying to cause harm. They were trying to understand how everything worked, and they were very good at it. The aesthetic of these boards was carefully cultivated. Names were chosen for mystery. Access was earned through demonstrated knowledge, not simply requested. The graphics, built from characters arranged into elaborate banners and logos, were aggressive and vivid. A visual language that communicated attitude before a single word of content was read. This was a culture that understood, years before anyone else, that visual design is a form of authority. Software moved through the modern world in distinct layers. A program would appear first on a handful of elite boards, visible only to established members. Then it would migrate outward, to mid-level boards, then to general boards accessible to almost anyone. By the time it reached the outermost layer, the inner circle had already moved on to something new. This was a supply chain with no warehouse, no trucks, and no official participants of any kind. The environmental and peace movements of the late 1980s built their own corner of the modern world. Networks carried organising materials, campaign strategies, and news reports that mainstream media was ignoring. For the first time, activists in different cities could coordinate on the same schedule without expensive calls. A message posted in the morning could reach 50 cities by midnight. The political potential of network communication was understood by these communities long before anyone in power had noticed it. No one owned the network. No company ran it. No government had approved it. It simply existed. There were game boards dedicated entirely to play. Multiplayer text adventures ran continuously on dedicated systems, allowing dozens of players to navigate the same virtual world simultaneously. You would move through rooms described in plain text, encounter other characters played by real people, solve puzzles, accumulate items, and build reputations that followed you across sessions. These were the first massively shared virtual worlds. They were entirely imaginary. They felt entirely real. A player who spent years on a single text world developed relationships with other regulars the way anyone develops relationships with people they see daily. The characters they played accumulated histories, the items found, the challenges completed, the alliances made. When a player left, their absence was noticed. When a long-absent player returned, it was celebrated. These were communities with genuine emotional stakes, built on nothing but text and shared imagination. The people who built these virtual worlds developed the first rules for governing online communities: what behaviour was acceptable, how to handle disputes, how to absorb new members who did not yet know the culture. These problems had never been solved before. The solutions they found became the template for every online community that followed, whether those later communities knew it or not. And in 1993, something began to change. The modern world could sense it before it understood it. The World Wide Web had existed in limited form since 1991, but most people in the modern world were barely aware of it. Their world was already complete. It had its own geography, its own culture, its own social hierarchies. Why would they need something new? Then flat-rate consumer internet access began to spread. New users arrived in millions. Almost none of them came through the modern world, and almost none of them knew it was there. The new users did not know the etiquette of the bulletin board. They did not know how to read a community through its text aesthetic. They did not understand the slow rhythm of a world that moved in 24-hour relay cycles. They arrived in enormous numbers all at once, and existing communities had no way to absorb the change. The experience was described, at the time, as a perpetual September that never ended. The web offered images, colours and sound. The old text world had no answer for that. Bulletin board operators began making the calculation. The web offered a larger audience. It offered easier access. It offered graphics and multimedia that no modem board could match. One by one, sysops moved their communities to the new medium or simply closed their boards entirely. The phone numbers that had been active for years went silent. The hand-copied lists of board numbers that users passed around like treasure maps became out of date overnight. The modem world was dying. The closure of a board was often abrupt. A sysop would post a final message, sometimes heartfelt, sometimes brief, and then the system would go offline. The phone number would stop connecting. The files, the message archives, the years of conversation, all of it would simply stop being accessible. There was no standard format for preservation. Most sysops knew of no archive to consult. When a board went down, its contents usually went with it. Between 1994 and 1998, tens of thousands of boards went offline. The conversations went with them. The losses were not just technical, they were human. The threads that had carried years of community discussion, the boards where people had come out in text to strangers who became friends, the medical archives whose content represented hard-won knowledge from a crisis the mainstream world had refused to document properly. All of this existed only in the memory of the people who had been there and on aging magnetic storage that no one had yet thought to read. The storage media were the problem. Boards ran on hardware of their era. Computers with drives already considered obsolete. A sysop who wanted to preserve their board's contents faced the immediate challenge that machines capable of reading that storage were increasingly hard to find. The knowledge was there in magnetic form, on shelves and in boxes. The means to access it was quietly disappearing. Magnetic storage degrades over time. The particles that encode information on a disk surface slowly lose alignment over years and decades. A disk that worked perfectly in 1989 might fail entirely by 2005. And even before physical failure, the formats become inaccessible. The specific software needed to interpret the data stops being maintained, stops running on any current hardware. The content survives in physical form while becoming unreachable in every practical sense. The data is present, the reader is gone. The phenomenon has a name: bit rot. The gradual degradation of digital data through the decay of storage media, the obsolescence of formats, and the disappearance of the software needed to interpret them. Physical artifacts survive in ways digital ones do not. A clay tablet from 3,000 years ago can still be read. A data format from 40 years ago sometimes cannot. The most permanent form of storage we ever invented is, in some ways, the most fragile. By the year 2000, the modem world was largely gone. The text-based virtual worlds had scattered or disbanded. Specialty networks had migrated to web forums, where new participants arrived with none of the shared history that made the original communities feel like home. What had taken 15 years to build had been dismantled in 5. The architecture remained in storage, but the life inside it had moved on. The irony was difficult to ignore. A culture that had pioneered networked community, built the first global support networks for marginalised groups, and spent 15 years solving the problems of online conversation. This culture had left almost no trace for the billions who came after it. The foundation was invisible because no one had thought to preserve it before building on top of it. Somewhere, in basements and storage units and forgotten rooms, the drives were still holding on, or they were not. The estimate of what was lost is difficult to make because almost no one was counting. Hundreds of thousands of active boards existed at the peak of the modem world. Each carried anywhere from a few hundred to tens of thousands of messages. The original conversations of the internet's first human communities. Arguments about music, confessions of loneliness, technical breakthroughs, jokes shared with strangers in darkened rooms, exist now only in the recollections of those who were there. The software libraries are partially preserved, scattered across archival projects of varying completeness. But the message archives, the conversations themselves, are almost entirely gone. A message posted in 1988 in a community of 200 regular users, discussing something that mattered deeply to all of them, is simply not recoverable. It ended when the board closed. It was never designed to be permanent. No one had imagined anyone would want to look back. What we lost was not just data. It was the texture of daily life for an entire generation of people. There were artists in the modern world, people who spent hundreds of hours creating elaborate works in text characters, portraits, scenes, animations, that existed only in the format of a specific terminal display. When the boards that hosted them went offline, the works went too. Some were copied to personal discs by their creators, most were not. The first major movement of native digital art created specifically for the digital medium, vanished almost completely before anyone thought to preserve it. There were writers. Long-form serial stories posted episode by episode across weeks and months. Communities of readers who followed them argued about character motivations, predicted endings. These were the first online fan communities built around original works that existed nowhere else. The writers often had no idea they were doing something significant. They were just telling stories to people who were listening. When the boards closed, the stories ended mid-sentence, and the readers dispersed. Some survivors kept their old discs for decades. They could not say why. They simply could not let go. Occasionally, something surfaces. A box of old discs discovered during a house move, a hard drive from a machine that stopped being used in 1995 but was never discarded. The data is often still there, waiting. Extracting it requires hardware that barely exists, drive controllers and machines running operating systems long abandoned. But sometimes it works, and sometimes what comes out is extraordinary. In one recovered archive, researchers found an unbroken message thread spanning 4 years, the same participants returning week after week, discussing the same evolving questions about a shared passion. You could read the entire arc, the way ideas developed, the way relationships formed, the way the community learned to talk to itself. It was like finding an intact fossil of something that should not have survived. In another, a sysop backed up their entire board on the last day before closing, not knowing if anyone would ever read it. They simply felt the work deserved to be kept. The backup sat on a shelf for 22 years. When it was finally read, it contained the records of a community no historian had ever documented. A detailed daily account of ordinary life in a specific city during a specific decade. A small community of researchers began to understand what had been lost. They started looking for it. The recovery work requires a specific kind of patience. You track down the people who ran boards 3 decades ago. Sysops who may or may not have kept backups. Some have nothing, some do not remember those years clearly. But some, when you explain what you are looking for, go very quiet. And then they tell you to wait while they check the storage room. That is when the work gets interesting. The physical recovery process involves hardware that most repair shops no longer stock, vintage drive controllers, machines running operating systems long abandoned. The data, when it finally loads, arrives in formats requiring specialist tools to interpret. Each step demands a different skill. The patience of an archivist, the knowledge of an engineer, and the instincts of someone who can recognize when a disk is about to fail permanently. Sometimes the disk loads, the cursor blinks, and 40 years of conversation appear on the screen. Recovered archives are carefully documented and deposited in collections maintained by universities, libraries, and independent preservation organisations. Each recovered board is catalogued, its dates noted, its participants counted, its content indexed. Not everything can be shared publicly. Some archives contain private messages never meant for other eyes. The archivists make difficult decisions about what to preserve for history and what to protect for the individuals who created it. Oral history projects have begun alongside the physical recovery work. Former sysops and regular users are interviewed about their experience of the modern world, what it felt like, what mattered, what they still remember after all these years. The answers are often deeply felt. People describe those boards the way others describe their hometown, the place they came from, that shaped who they became, that no longer exists in any form they can visit. The people interviewed often have not spoken about their modern world years in a long time. They tend to start carefully. Names, dates, technical details. But within a few minutes the tone changes. They begin to talk about specific conversations, specific relationships, specific boards that felt like home in a way no physical place quite did. The emotional memory of the modern world is remarkably intact, even after 3 decades. One of the most significant ongoing archival projects has recovered material from several thousand boards. Millions of messages, tens of thousands of files, communities spanning dozens of countries. It is one of the most complete records of pre-web internet culture in existence, and it represents only a fraction of what was out there. The researchers estimate the majority of the modern world's content is gone beyond recovery. This is what remains. What the recovered archives reveal is a world more sophisticated than most people assume. The conversations are articulate, searching and modern in their concerns. People debating the nature of privacy in a networked world in 1989. People arguing about the ethics of software sharing in 1991. People building international community networks with no corporate backing and no institutional permission. The problems they were working on are the same problems we are still working on today. There are moments of tenderness in the recovered archives that are startling to encounter. A message posted late at night by someone who had found, through a modem board, the first community that made them feel understood. A reply from a stranger that said exactly the right thing. These interactions were invisible to the outside world. They were real. They mattered to the people who had them. Most of it is gone. What remains is only the fragment that happened to survive by chance. The modern world raises a question with no comfortable answer. We tend to assume that digital records are permanent, that what is stored online will remain accessible indefinitely. The modern world suggests otherwise. An entire civilization of communication and community existed for 15 years, then disappeared within a decade, leaving almost no trace. Not because anyone chose to destroy it, simply because no one chose, in time, to save it. The digital preservation community calls this the dark archive problem. For most of human history, knowledge was lost through deliberate destruction. But in the modern world, the loss was entirely passive. No one erased those boards. They simply stopped being maintained. And in the absence of maintenance, digital content reverts to silence faster than almost any other medium. The darkness does not have to be chosen, it only has to be permitted. Every community that exists online today is, in some sense, building on ground that has already been lost before. The researchers who dig through old drives are not motivated primarily by nostalgia. They are motivated by the same impulse that drives any archaeologist. The conviction that what people did and said and made and felt deeply is worth remembering, even when the world has moved on, even when the platforms have changed, even when the conversations have long since fallen silent. Every human community leaves traces. These traces are worth finding. The work continues. New volunteers join every year, drawn by the combination of technical challenge and historical meaning. Old machines are repaired and put back into service. Dusty drives are carefully imaged, their contents copied to modern formats before the magnetic particles lose their final alignment. It is slow, painstaking, and often disappointing work. And occasionally it yields something that has not been seen for 30 years. Somewhere, in a box in a closet, there are drives that no one has looked at yet. The modern world is gone, but it was real. The people who spent their evenings in those glowing text interfaces were doing something that mattered, building community, sharing knowledge, finding each other across distances that had been impassable. Their conversations are mostly beyond recovery now, but the fact that those conversations happened, that those communities existed, that those connections were made, that cannot be erased. It is simply history most of us have not yet read. If you are watching this, you are part of a digital community. What you build here will not last forever. Nothing does. The question is not whether it will survive, but whether someone someday will think it was worth finding out what you did together and why it mattered. The modern world did not know it was building something worth remembering, and it was. Where you are building now, so are you. In a vault in London, a book sits that was written before the Crusades began. It can still be read. In 1086, after conquering England, a ruler ordered a survey of every village, every farm, every field in his new kingdom. Scribes travelled the length of the island. They recorded landowners, livestock, the value of each plot of land. The survey was completed in a single year. The result was 2 volumes bound in leather, the most complete picture of an entire nation ever committed to parchment. 9 centuries later, it has never stopped being readable. Not many records can claim that. 9 centuries have passed. The language is strange now. An archaic blend of Latin and Old French, but the letters are clear. The ink has held, the parchment has not crumbled. Historians read it directly. They do not need special equipment. They do not need to decode a proprietary format. The survey from 1,000 years ago is simply there, open on a reading stand, waiting to be consulted by anyone with the patience to learn its language. Nothing about it had ever faded. In 1984, a different kind of record-keeping project began. It was modern. It was digital. It was already doomed. A national broadcaster commissioned an ambitious project. They would create a new version of the ancient survey, updated for the modern age. School children across the country contributed photographs, written descriptions, and recordings of everyday life in their communities. The result was a 2-disc set that captured an entire nation at a precise moment in 1986. Hundreds of thousands of photographs, thousands of local profiles. A detailed snapshot encoded on laser discs in a format no one else had ever used. To play the discs, you needed a specific computer, a model produced by a small technology company and discontinued within years of the project's launch. You also needed a special disc player manufactured in limited quantities by a European electronics firm. The software used an obscure programming language that never became mainstream. Every element was proprietary. Every element depended on hardware already growing scarce before the decade was out. The clock was running before anyone knew that a clock had started. By 1992, finding a working playback system had become difficult. By the year 2000, it was nearly impossible. In 2002, a researcher made a quiet observation. The original parchment survey from 1086 sat in its archive, perfectly legible. The 1986 digital version, just 15 years old, was functionally inaccessible. The hardware to read it had become rare. The disc players were failing. The format was understood by almost no one still working in the field. The irony was so stark that it made international news. Something had gone deeply wrong with how modern civilization chose to store its memories. Researchers gave the problem a name. They called it the digital dark age, not because data was being deliberately erased, but because the infrastructure required to access stored data was quietly decaying around it. The magnetic tapes were intact. Discs were physically fine. But the machines that could read them were gone. The software that could interpret the files was gone. The data was frozen in a format that the future had simply walked away from and forgotten to unlock. This was not a single isolated failure, it was a pattern. One that repeated itself across decades, across industries, across institutions that should have known better. The question that began forming in the minds of archivists and historians was a quiet one, but it did not go away. How much of what we think we have saved is actually gone? How many records, how many images, how many pieces of culture are locked inside formats the world no longer knows how to open? To understand why this keeps happening, you have to understand what it means to store something as digital data. Data at its most fundamental level is a sequence of ones and zeros. That sequence can represent a text document, a photograph, a piece of music. The sequence itself does not decay the way ink fades or paper crumbles, but to make it meaningful again you need two things: software that understands the format in which the data is stored and hardware capable of running that software. Remove either one and the sequence becomes meaningless noise no one can decipher. One without the other fails. In the early decades of personal computing, every company invented its own format. Word processors saved files that only they could open. Image editors created file types competing programs could not read. Database systems used structures that were never publicly documented. By the time the personal computer revolution was at its peak, there were hundreds of proprietary formats in active use, each one an implicit contract between a company and its customers that expired the moment the company ceased to exist. When those companies closed, the contract expired. The data sat on disks. The ability to read it did not survive. One of the most widely used word processors of the 1980s stored documents in a format that embedded control codes directly into the text. Millions of documents were written in this system: business contracts, academic papers, personal letters. When the company declined, users moved on to newer software. The documents remained on their disks, but opening them required tools that most users could not easily find. Quietly, the documents became inaccessible to the very people who had written them. It happened again and again. The problem was not only software. The storage media themselves were failing. Magnetic floppy disks, the dominant personal data format through the 1980s and into the 1990s, had a lifespan measured in decades under ideal conditions. Temperature fluctuations, humidity, stray magnetic interference. Any of these could degrade or destroy data entirely. Reel-to-reel magnetic tape used by institutions to store large datasets proved even more vulnerable. The material binding the magnetic coating to the tape had a tendency to disintegrate. The loss was often total. Archivists began finding that tape stored for decades at room temperature had simply turned to powder on the shelf. This had its own name among those who worked to save old data: sticky shed syndrome. The glue that held the coating to the tape soaked up moisture from the air over years. When the tape was run under stress, the glue gave way. The small magnetic bits that held the data fell free and left a bare, clean strip behind. Labs found that tape stored for decades were falling apart this way. Gentle oven heat could slow the process, but only briefly. The introduction of optical discs in the 1980s seemed to promise permanence. The format was marketed as a medium that would last forever. The reality was more complicated. Certain disc formulations were susceptible to a chemical breakdown, a reaction between the reflective layer and oxygen entering through microgaps in the coating. Discs that appeared flawless on the outside had sections of data quietly disappearing from within. The damage often became apparent only when the disc simply failed to play. No repair could reverse it. You press play. The machine searches, then silence. The disc appears flawless. The data inside is gone. The failures extended beyond physics. Institutions holding irreplaceable records often did not understand what they had. Libraries discarded reels of tape to free up shelf space. Studios sold off early recordings for the silver in the film stock. Government agencies migrated data between systems and discovered, years later, that the migration had been incomplete. Each loss was its own quiet catastrophe, a piece of the record that no one had thought to treat as precious until it was already gone. Underlying all of these failures was a shared assumption, one so intuitive it was rarely examined aloud. People believed that digital was more permanent than physical. A book could burn. A photograph could fade. But a file, copied and recopied, backed up and distributed, surely that was safe. The assumption was wrong, and the error proved expensive. Digital files required continuous maintenance, migration, and investment in infrastructure that most institutions had not planned for and many could not indefinitely sustain. The same failure appeared at every scale, from personal computers to space agencies to repositories of national memory. The National Space Agency of the United States built up decades of raw data on magnetic tape gathered from missions launched in the 1960s and 1970s. The data was priceless. Readings from the lunar surface, data from early planetary probes, images from parts of the solar system that no later mission had gone back to. When researchers tried to reach those tapes in the 1990s, a large portion of the data was in formats that no one at the agency could read. Software needed to interpret those formats had been written by programmers who had long since left the agency. Some had retired decades earlier, some had died. Documentation, if it had ever been written, could not be found. Research teams spent months working backward from the raw binary patterns on the tape, deducing painstakingly what each sequence of bits was meant to represent. Some datasets were eventually recovered, others were permanently and quietly lost, with no notice and no ceremony. In a climate-controlled room, thousands of tape reels sit in perfect condition. No machine on the premises can read them. The problem extended to the internet itself. Platforms that once hosted millions of personal pages. The first spaces where ordinary people put their words and images online were shut down with little warning. Years of content vanished in hours. When people tried to access archived versions through web preservation services, the captures were often incomplete. Video files had not been saved. Interactive elements had not been recorded. The pages existed only as hollow outlines of what they had once been. Discussion forums that had operated continuously for years. Communities built around books, games, scientific interests, and shared passions were shut down by hosting companies that no longer found them profitable. In some cases, users received a few weeks of notice. In others, the forums vanished one morning without any announcement at all. Decades of accumulated knowledge. Troubleshooting archives, creative writing collections, conversations between people who had formed genuine friendships there. Gone without ceremony and without any surviving record. You click the bookmark you kept for years. The page loads blank. The address resolves to nothing at all. Among the most painful losses were those involving early online video platforms. Before the dominant hosting services of today, smaller competitors hosted experimental and creative work that existed nowhere else. When those companies ran out of funding or were acquired and restructured, their video archives rarely survived the transition. The early work of filmmakers and performers who had used these platforms as their first public stage simply ceased to exist in any accessible form. There was no notice. There were no copies. The gaming industry experienced its own quiet catastrophe. The source code for video games, the human-readable text from which software is compiled, was frequently discarded after a game shipped. Companies moved on and cleared their storage systems. When remasters were attempted years later, the original files could not be found. Titles that had sold millions of copies had to be reconstructed almost entirely from scratch. In some cases, reconstruction proved too expensive and the projects were quietly abandoned entirely. The earliest years of the public internet produced a visual culture unlike anything before or since. Personal web pages were designed with an enthusiasm unconstrained by professional convention. Blinking elements, tiled backgrounds, guestbooks, web rings that linked strangers across the world based on shared obsessions. Almost none of the original pages survive in functioning form today. Their interactive elements require software that modern browsers will not run. They can be visited only as partial static captures, incomplete outlines of what they once were. You find a page from 1997 in the archive. Half the images are missing. The embedded music will not play. Some of the earliest online virtual worlds built sustained communities of thousands of people over years of shared experience. Players created objects, structures, and entire narratives that existed only inside the system. When those services shut down, the worlds disappeared entirely. No export function, no archive, no mechanism to preserve what had been built inside. The relationships, the humour, The collective memory of those communities survived only in the minds of the people who had been fortunate enough to be there. No records existed. But there is another side to this story. People noticed what was happening, and some of them decided to act. The discipline that emerged to address these failures did not have a clean origin. Librarians had worried about digital fragility for decades. Computer scientists had written about format obsolescence since the 1980s. What changed was the scale of the problem. The recognition that without coordinated effort, a significant portion of 20th century recorded culture would become permanently inaccessible within a single generation. Digital preservation became, slowly and unevenly, a recognised field with its own methods, its own tools, and its own urgency. One of the most visible preservation efforts began with a single institution's decision to crawl the web and store copies of everything it found. The project grew into an archive containing hundreds of billions of captured pages stretching back to the mid-1990s. For many early websites, this archive holds the only surviving record. Researchers and journalists use it daily to access pages that would otherwise be gone, to verify what was once written, to recover voices that would otherwise have vanished. The digital domesday had a partial end. A team of experts did the hard work of replicating the old hardware and code, writing programs that could act like the dead machine well enough to read the old disks. The data was pulled out, put into new formats, and shared online at last. The rescue took years and needed a real push from a committed team. A shorter window, and the data would have been gone for good. No copy would have survived. In university labs and private collections, volunteers are systematically working through hardware that has not been powered on in decades. In Britain, a university library launched a project to rescue data from floppy disks that had arrived alongside donated research collections. Physical media holding the working files of academics, writers and scientists. The disks represented dozens of different types, recorded in dozens of different formats, many of them proprietary and long discontinued. Preservationists used custom-built hardware and specialised software to create digital copies of each disk, then worked methodically to identify and decode the specific format in which each had been recorded. What they found included drafts of published novels with extensive revisions the authors had never shared publicly, revealing the thought process behind works studied in universities. Research notes from scientific papers cited thousands of times, showing the reasoning behind methodological choices that had shaped entire fields. Personal correspondence from historically significant figures whose physical letters had been deposited with the library, but whose digital files had been assumed inaccessible forever. The disks did not hold only files, they held layers of thought. Each disk is treated with the care reserved for ancient manuscripts. In a real sense, that is what they are. Recovery efforts at the National Space Agency produced remarkable results in some cases. Teams working through decades-old mission data found images of planetary surfaces taken by probes that had long since ceased to function, the only photographs of those locations that would ever exist. Applying modern computational processing revealed detail that the original hardware had been incapable of displaying. The data had been sitting on those tapes for 40 years. It simply required the right tools, the right patience, and the right people. Parallel efforts came from communities with no formal preservation mandate. Amateur programmers who had grown up with early home computers formed organisations dedicated to preserving the software of their childhood. Not as an archival project, but as a labour of love. They built software that replicated the exact behaviour of discontinued operating systems. They tracked down original developers and persuaded them to donate code. They bought old hardware at auctions and kept it operational for the benefit of anyone who wanted it. The same impulse drove efforts to preserve early video game software. Volunteers reverse-engineered proprietary cartridge formats, documented the behaviour of hardware chips at the transistor level, and created emulation software accurate enough to run programs that had been commercially unavailable for 30 years. In some cases, these efforts recovered titles that the original publishers had entirely lost and could not themselves have reproduced. The hobbyist community had preserved things the commercial entities behind them had allowed to quietly vanish. They did it for free. The law around this work was hard and often hostile. Most rules on rights had not been set up with the idea that digital formats might one day rot. Saving old files or early web pages meant making copies. And making copies, for any reason, could be treated as a legal breach. Institutions doing this work had to get around rules not made for a world where the first copy is the only one left. The clash of law and memory was never resolved. The law was written for a world where copies reduce the value of originals. Digital preservation inverts that logic. The people who did this work agreed on one hard truth. The only sound path was to keep moving data forward. From one format to the next. From one storage type to the next. Not once, but every 10 to 20 years, each time old hardware died or old formats were dropped. This was not a single task. It was a long, steady cost that most groups had not planned for and many could not keep up with over time. There was no other path. One answer was to use open, shared formats that no single firm owned. Anyone could read them. Anyone could write tools to open them. Files stored in these open forms could still be read decades later by new software, long after the first programs that made them were gone. The rule was clear. A format that anyone can build for can outlive any one firm. Use was slow and uneven, but where it took hold, the files survived. It held when tried. Emulation offered a different approach. Rather than migrating data to new formats, you could migrate the entire environment in which the data had originally been created. Write software that replicated the exact behavior of a 1980s operating system. Run that software on modern hardware. Open the original files as if nothing had changed. This preserves something that simple file conversion could not. The exact visual and behavioral context of the original. How the software had looked and how it had felt to use. No one group could fix this on its own. Slowly, those who cared began to work across borders. Libraries shared tools for finding old formats. Archives built up shared lists of dead storage types. Coding groups put their work online under free terms that anyone could use and adapt. The same internet that had let so much slip away became, in a quiet irony, a place where the global effort to save what was left found its home. Some of the most significant preservation work was done by individuals with no institutional affiliation. People who had worked in early computing and quietly kept copies of software from their careers. Collectors who maintained hardware in climate-controlled spaces for decades out of personal attachment. Enthusiasts who built websites cataloguing specific pieces of lost software, posting what they had found, connecting with others who might hold the missing pieces. The community was remarkably small. The gap between its size and its impact was extraordinary. The results were mixed, as they always are when preservation arrives late. Some things were recovered completely. Software believed gone for decades emerged from private collections. Films assumed destroyed turned up in foreign broadcaster archives. But for every recovery, there were permanent losses. Tapes too deteriorated to image. Discs too corroded to read. Formats too obscure to decode without documentation that was itself gone. Quiet, irreversible, each loss a small reduction in the collective record. Without drama, without announcement. Some things were simply gone. Everything that has been lost took years to lose. The digital world today is losing things faster than ever. In 2026, the problem has not been solved. In some respects, it has accelerated beyond what anyone predicted. The amount of data made each day is hard to picture. Billions of photos are taken. Hours of video go up every minute. Billions of messages are sent. The systems needed to store even a path this vast and still growing. The systems needed to keep it all usable for decades to come barely exist at scale. Most platforms are built for right now, not for the scholars or the curious minds that will come long after. The culture of this decade exists almost entirely on platforms that have no preservation mandate. When a platform changes its policies, updates its systems, or simply shuts down, the creative output of millions of people can vanish without warning. Artists who built years of work on early social platforms found that everything existed only at the discretion of a server they did not own. The archives of communities, the documentation of social movements, the creative work of an era, contingent on corporate survival. Personal correspondence, the kind of primary source material historians have relied on for centuries, now exists almost entirely in systems controlled by third-party services. When those services change their terms, discontinue accounts, or are acquired and restructured, the messages can disappear entirely. The private letters of this generation, the ones that might one day tell future historians what it felt like to live in this particular moment, are subject to deletion by algorithmic policy changes that no individual can prevent. You search for the account you have used for 15 years. The service tells you it was deleted last April. The video content created by independent producers over the past 2 decades exists largely within platforms that can alter their policies at any moment. Millions of videos have already been removed due to policy changes, account closures, or shifts in what kinds of content a platform chooses to host. Some of this material was unambiguously important. Documentation of historical events, irreplaceable performances, educational resources that had served hundreds of thousands of people. None of it was legally required to be preserved. The digital age has produced a paradox. We have more information than any previous civilization. More recorded, more catalogued, more interconnected, and much of that information is less secure than it has ever been. A clay tablet written 4,000 years ago can be read by anyone who learns the language. A file created 20 years ago on discontinued software stored on failed hardware may be inaccessible today, even though the underlying data remains technically intact somewhere on the original medium. Some institutions have developed rigorous frameworks for managing this risk. Requirements that data be held in multiple physically separate locations simultaneously. Commitments to migrate file formats on a scheduled cycle. Published catalogues describing exactly what is held and in what condition. Investment in the research needed to keep old software environments running. The difference between institutions that do this well and those that do not is not primarily technical. It comes down to whether this work has been assigned real, sustained priority. There are reasons for cautious optimism. Awareness of digital preservation has grown substantially in recent years. Major cultural institutions have developed strategies that would have seemed sophisticated a decade ago. Open source communities have built emulation tools that preserve the full experience of early computing environments with remarkable accuracy. International frameworks for sharing preserved content have improved significantly. The work remains hard, underfunded, and never entirely finished, but it is being done, and it is making a measurable difference. The people doing this work are often motivated not by institutional mandate, but by something more personal. A sense that the record matters, that what people made and said and thought deserves to survive. That history is not only the great official events preserved in government vaults, but the texture of ordinary life. The websites, the games, the messages, the creative experiments of people who were alive in a particular moment and left something behind for anyone who might one day look. In quiet rooms, a small number of people work each day to ensure the past is not entirely erased. And what of the things that will not be saved? The conversation's already gone, the platform's already closed, the tape's already too deteriorated to recover, the disc's too corroded to read. These are losses without drama, no fire, no flood, no deliberate destruction. Just time and the quiet assumption that someone else had already made a copy. The digital dark age is not a single catastrophe. It is a slow accumulation of small silences, each one unremarked, each one permanent. Time did the rest. The original survey from 1086 sits in its archive, still readable, consulted by scholars who want to know what England looked like before anyone now alive was born. Somewhere in a storage facility, A laserdisc from 1986 holds tens of thousands of images of a nation at a precise moment in time. The parchment needed only good materials. The disc needs care and patience and people who understand what they are looking at before it is too late. The people who made that ancient survey did not think about its 1,000-year lifespan. They wrote carefully and used durable materials without knowing how long those choices would matter. We do not have that luxury of unknowing. We are the first civilization that has had to make a conscious choice about what survives. Every decision about format, every decision to allocate resources to preservation rather than something else. These are decisions about whose records the future will be able to read. Which piece of digital history do you think matters most to preserve? Perhaps it is the cultural record of a platform you grew up with. Perhaps it is early software that shaped how you learned to think. Perhaps it is something smaller, a website, a game, a corner of the internet that once felt like home. Whatever it is, the window to save it is narrower than it appears. And somewhere right now, it is already beginning to close. Somewhere in northern Germany, a teenager pressed record. He did not know what he was starting. It was sometime in the early 1980s. German radio stations played music late into the night, mixing well-known artists with original acts, local recordings, and unknown bands that would never make it further than a local club. A teenager sat in his bedroom with a cassette recorder running, capturing whatever he liked the sound of. He cut out the DJ voices deliberately, leaving only the music. He wanted clean recordings. He did not always catch the names, but he knew what moved him. One song in particular was different from the others. It had a moody, melancholic quality, a restless energy, like music recorded in a city that does not quite trust the morning. The singer's voice carried an accent the teenager could not quite place. The instruments layered carefully, almost carefully enough. The recording lasted around 3 minutes. He had no idea who made it. He wrote a question mark on the cassette case next to it and moved on. The cassette went into a drawer. Question mark stayed, and the song slept for more than 20 years. The 1980s gave way to the 90s and then to the 2000s. The teenager grew into an adult. He moved away from the coastal city where he had grown up. The cassette travelled with him in a box, the way small objects from childhood do. It was not important. It was not even musical to him anymore. It was just a tape he had kept. The question mark on the label had faded. The music inside had not. The magnetic tape inside the cassette was aging. All magnetic tape does. The iron oxide particles that hold a sound recording begin to shed over time, a process so quiet it is invisible until it is too late. The music captured on that cassette was decaying at the molecular level, one microscopic flake at a time. No one was listening, no one was preserving it, no one even knew it mattered yet. His sister was curious about the old tapes. She had grown up in the same house, heard some of the same music. There was something compelling about recovering old recordings. Not just the sound, but the act of finding something that had almost been lost. She spent time with a cassette player and a computer, converting analog waves into digital files, one tape at a time. The process is painstaking. Magnetic tape is fragile. She did not want to lose whatever was left. When she reached the tape with the question mark, she listened again. The sound quality was rough. There was the hiss of analog recording, the subtle warping of old tape, a slight mechanical flutter in the playback. But the song was still there, still moody, still unidentified. She typed a few words into an online forum. Does anyone know this song? And attached the audio. She did not expect much, she just wanted to know. The year was 2007. The internet was already large. Video sites, music databases, forums for every possible interest. If a song had ever been professionally released, someone online would know it. The tools for identifying music were still primitive by later standards, but the human knowledge base was enormous. The right person, given the right audio clip, could identify almost anything. could identify it, that is, unless the song had never been widely released at all. The initial responses to the forum post were well-intentioned but unhelpful. Guesses came in, names of known new wave artists, suggestions of similar sounding tracks. None of them matched. Professional music databases had no record of it. Audio fingerprinting tools came back empty. The song existed outside every catalogue, every register, every database. It was in the audio file she had uploaded. It was nowhere else on the accessible internet. The silence from official sources was total. What remained was the song itself. Roughly 3 minutes of unnamed music from an unnamed band recorded off a German radio station that no longer kept archives of that era. The original broadcaster had no searchable record for those years. The DJ who had played it was untraceable. The band that performed it had left no digital footprint. The internet knew nothing. And for a while the search quietly stalled. But the post stayed up, and in the strange, patient way of online communities, it occasionally attracted fresh attention. Someone new would stumble across it and try again. A music historian would listen and offer a careful guess. A linguist would note something about the singer's accent. Nothing led anywhere conclusive. The song became a small, persistent open question. Not famous, not solved, not forgotten. Just waiting. The audio files circulated slowly through music forums. Each new listener heard the same mystery the original poster had. Online music communities had been solving mysteries like this for years. Someone would share a half-remembered melody from a film, a jingle from a television show, a snippet of something their parent used to play. The collective intelligence of thousands of music lovers was remarkable. They had identified songs from a few hummed bars. They had traced recordings to regional radio stations in countries most people never thought about. This was difficult, but difficult was not impossible. The tools available to the early searchers were limited. Music recognition software of that era was built on commercial catalogues. It matched what was in a database and returned nothing when no match existed. The song had never been commercially released in any form that entered a catalogue. No label, no distributor, no digital storefronts. The song predated the era when small regional bands routinely released music independently. It had simply been played on radio, then vanished. Researchers who listened carefully noted several characteristics. The song appeared to be from the early to mid-1980s, based on the production style and instrumentation. The synthesizer textures and guitar tone pointed toward new wave or post-punk. The singer's accent suggested German origins but was not definitively placeable. The lyrics, partially audible, contained a phrase some interpreted as a place name. These were leads. None of them went anywhere. The search flickered. Interest rose and fell across the years like a signal drifting in and out of range. For roughly 12 years, the mystery bubbled along at a low frequency. Occasional posts, occasional new guesses, occasional dead ends. The audio file migrated from platform to platform as the internet itself changed. The forums of 2007 looked different from the platforms of 2015, but the song remained the same, and so did the question attached to it. No one could say who had made it, or why it had vanished so completely. By 2019, the internet had changed profoundly. Individual forums and music newsgroups had given way to large aggregated communities where millions of users could encounter the same content simultaneously. A post that might have received 200 responses in 2007 could reach 200,000 people by 2019. Someone reposted the mystery audio to one of these large communities. Within hours, it had attracted tens of thousands of listeners. The response was unlike anything the mystery had seen before. Users arrived from different backgrounds. Professional musicians, acoustic engineers, and historians of regional German culture. The song was analysed with tools that had not existed in 2007. Waveform visualizers, spectral analysis software, audio comparison engines. None of them found a match. But the community forming around the effort was enormous. A dedicated forum section was created specifically for the search. Within weeks, it had grown to tens of thousands of members. Ground rules emerged organically. Do not post guesses without evidence. Search a band thoroughly before suggesting it. Document what has already been eliminated. The community had the discipline of a research team and the energy of people doing something they genuinely believed mattered. They called the song the most mysterious song on the internet, and the name stuck. Tens of thousands of bands had been checked and eliminated. The answer was somewhere in the silence between. The methodology grew more refined. Community members compiled lists of every new wave band active in Germany between 1980 and 1988. They cross-referenced these with regional festival records, radio archives, and music reviews from the era. When a band was identified as possible, a searcher would contact former members directly, writing to old addresses, sending messages to people who had not been in a band for 30 years. Most did not respond. Some said no. The acoustic analysis team was particularly systematic. They isolated individual instrument tracks and compared them against known recordings. The guitar style pointed toward a subset of German post-punk. The drum machine had a pattern suggesting a specific hardware sequencer from the mid-80s. The synthesizer patch was unusual. Not a preset, something programmed by someone with access to particular hardware. This was getting precise. But precise was not enough. False identifications were a recurring problem. Occasionally a community member would post what appeared to be a breakthrough. A band name, a song title, a recording that sounded unmistakably similar. The community would surge with excitement, then deflate when the comparison fell apart. The temptation to declare a solution is powerful when a mystery has lasted long enough. Each false answer left the community a little more cautious, a little more rigorous, and a little more determined. The singer's voice was one of the hardest elements to analyse. Voices are deeply individual, and the vocal on the mystery recording was partially obscured by the recording conditions. The cassette quality, the radio broadcast compression, the decades of magnetic decay. Linguists who listened could narrow the origin to a general region of northern Germany, but nothing more specific. The exact accent was somewhere between coastal northern German and something more neutral, as if the singer had been trained. 2020, 2021. The search continued through a lockdown world. There is something particular about a mystery that has already survived long enough to resist smart people with good tools. This mystery had done that. It had outlasted music identification software archivists, professional musicians, and acoustic engineers. Each failure did not diminish it. Each failure made it more compelling. By the time 2 years had passed since the surge in interest, the community was still there, still searching, still certain an answer existed. The community developed a kind of collective mythology around the song. Theories multiplied. Some believed it was not a professional recording at all, that it was a demo tape, something the band made in a living room, played on local radio once and never again. Others believed it had been released on a limited regional pressing, the cassette sold at a small venue, copies long since discarded. A few believed it had been deliberately kept secret, for reasons no one could articulate. There was also the question of the song itself. People listened not for analysis, but for the experience. Members wrote about what the song felt like, the texture of that synthesizer line, the way the voice hesitated before certain syllables, the sense of a melody trying to remember itself. The mystery had become inseparable from the music. You could not hear one without the other. Someone always came back. Someone always found a new angle, a new archive, a new thread to pull. In 2022, a researcher spent months contacting former employees of the relevant broadcasting station. Most could not remember specific songs from nearly 4 decades earlier. Some described how playlist records were kept, not carefully enough to be useful. One recalled that unsigned local acts were sometimes played without full documentation. This was consistent with what the community suspected, but it still did not identify the song. A parallel team focused on geography. The song was believed to originate in northern Germany. New wave bands in that region during the early 1980s had a particular circuit. The same venues, the same festivals, The same occasional radio opportunities. Someone mapped these circuits, building a picture of that local music scene. The research narrowed the search considerably, but the band was still not in any record they had found. By 2023, many in the community had accepted that the mystery might remain unresolved, not because they had given up, but because they were honest about what they had and had not found. Every band that fit the description had been checked. Every archive that could plausibly contain the relevant records had been contacted. The search had been thorough in a way that few internet efforts ever are, and still nothing. The answer would come when it came from a direction no one had thought to look. In late 2023, a researcher who had been following the mystery became interested in the community's geographic hypothesis. Northern Germany, early 1980s, new wave, small venues. He began searching not music databases but local newspaper archives, a digitised historical record of small-town cultural life, newspapers that had covered local concerts and events in those years. This was a different kind of research, slower, more patient. He found references to an event organised by the Northern German public broadcaster, a showcase for emerging regional acts. Local bands performed and the event was covered in local newspapers. In the column inches of small concert reviews, band names appeared that had never made it into any music database, acts so local they had left no other digital footprints. The researcher began going through each of them, one at a time. It was painstaking work of the kind that does not look impressive from the outside. Reading archived newspaper pages, cross-referencing names, looking for bands that fit the description in the mystery recording, the instrumentation, the era, the geography. Most names led nowhere. A few were identifiable but clearly wrong. And then one name appeared in a review from 1984. A small group from a coastal city. The review mentioned a keyboard player, a guitarist, and a singer with an unusual voice. He found a way to contact a former member of that group. The message he sent was simple. Do you still have any recordings from that time? The wait that followed was the kind of silence that can mean anything, and then a reply arrived. Yes. There were some old cassettes. Yes, there were recordings. One of them was a song with a title he had not heard in 40 years. The title was 3 words. The researcher read them and went very still. He compared the recording the former member sent against the mystery audio, the voice, the synthesizer line, the guitar tone, the drum machine pattern, the structure of the melody. He listened multiple times, carefully, the way the community had trained thousands of people to listen carefully. There was no reasonable doubt. This was the same song, the same performance. The same recording that a teenager in northern Germany had captured from a radio broadcast more than 40 years earlier. He knew. He had found it. On the 4th of November 2024, a single post appeared in the community. I found it. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of comments arrived within the first hour. People who had been searching for years, or 6 months, arrived at the same moment of collective recognition. There was verification to be done. But even before the rigorous analysis was complete, most people who listened knew. The particular certainty that comes from 17 years of careful listening was unmistakable. This was it. The verification process was careful and thorough. Community members with the deepest audio analysis expertise compared the original mystery recording against the version provided by the former band member. The waveforms aligned. The acoustic fingerprints matched. The specific characteristics that had puzzled the community. The synthesizer patch, the vocal phrasing, the drum machine timing, were all explained by the same recording session, the same band, in northern Germany in 1984. The news travelled faster than anything the community had seen before. The 17-year question had an answer. Major news outlets picked up the story within 24 hours. The mystery of the most mysterious song on the internet had been one of those recurring internet curiosities that journalists return to occasionally over the years. But now it had an ending, a resolution, a band name, a song title. The coverage was global. The The story appeared in European outlets, American media, online publications in a dozen languages. Everyone wanted to know who the band was and what they had to say. Somewhere on the northern coast of Germany, a retired musician's phone began to ring. He did not understand why. The band had been 4 people in their early 20s when they recorded that song. By the time the internet found them, they were in their late 60s. They had not played music together professionally for decades. They had not known that a recording from 1984 had been heard by millions of people who could not name them. They had been famous in absentia, celebrated without knowledge. The song had travelled further without them than it ever had with them. One of the former band members gave an interview shortly after the identification was confirmed. He said the group was absolutely overwhelmed. They had not noticed any internet phenomenon. The song's title was not known online, so there was no way for them to trace it. He learned about it only when someone reached out directly. What the song had become while they were simply living their lives was difficult to absorb. The community that had formed around the search processed the resolution in complicated ways. There was enormous relief. There was satisfaction. The intellectual satisfaction of a question answered, a puzzle solved after the kind of effort that no single person could have managed alone. There was also something that resembled grief. The mystery had been the centre of the community's identity for years. Its resolution meant a kind of ending. The forum was still there, but the reason for it had changed. The question that had lasted 17 years closed in a single afternoon. The silence it left was enormous. The technical documentation of the solution was meticulous. The community published a detailed account of how the identification had been made and what had been confirmed by the former band members. Every claim was sourced. Every comparison was provided for independent review. The methodology that thousands of volunteers had refined over years of failed attempts had, in the end, worked exactly as it was supposed to. What remained was the question of the song itself. For 17 years it had existed only as a mystery, a degraded cassette recording of unknown origin. Now it had a name and a band. A family member located a cassette copy of the original broadcast recording, and a higher quality version was found in the lead singer's personal archives. The master tape was still missing, but there was enough to confirm what had been found. The band behind the mystery had formed in a coastal city in northern Germany in 1983. 4 young musicians who loved the sound coming out of Britain and continental Europe. Moody, electronic, slightly restless. They played local venues. They recorded a handful of songs. They performed at a regional festival organised by the local public broadcaster. One of those performances, or a recording from around that time, made it onto the radio. Someone taped it. That was enough. They played small stages in a coastal city. They did not know the radio was listening at all. The history of the band exists only in fragments now, a cassette with a few songs, a handful of newspaper reviews from small local publications, photographs from performances in the mid-80s that circulate in the online community as historical documents. The band members scattered after a few years, as most young bands do. Life rearranged itself around careers and families in the ordinary distances of time. Music was something they had done once when they were young. For 40 years, a cassette recorded in 1984 was just an old tape, a memory of something they had been, not pride or loss, just a fact. They had not kept track of it. They could not have imagined that tens of thousands of people were listening obsessively, analysing every second, trying to reach them across 4 decades of silence. The reaction of the former band members to the discovery was a mixture of emotions that is difficult to categorise. Overwhelmed, one of them said. Moved, in the way that unexpected recognition moves people who had not prepared for it. There was also a kind of disbelief. The strangeness of learning that a piece of your younger self had been travelling the world without you, accumulating listeners and meaning in your absence, for longer than most careers in music last. They had been unknown for 40 years. In a week, millions learned their name. It did not feel real. Almost immediately, conversations began about what came next. A recording label expressed interest in formally releasing the song. The community that had spent years searching for the band now wanted to support them, to give the music a proper release, a proper credit, a proper place in the record. The idea of a vinyl pressing, a physical object that carried the band's name, was discussed. The formal release happened in the months following the identification. The original cassette recording, cleaned and remastered with care, was pressed onto vinyl by a small independent label. For the first time in 40 years, the song had a cover, had a catalogue number. It had a place in the physical and digital world where you could find it with just a name. The community that had created the demand watched the release with the quiet satisfaction of having made something happen. The re-release attracted attention far beyond the original community. Music journalists who had covered the search wrote about the resolution. Streaming catalogues that had never hosted the song added it. Listeners who had heard the mystery audio but had not been part of the search now encountered it with full context. A name, a band, a story, a 40-year journey from a cassette in a drawer to a vinyl pressing with proper credits and a place in the permanent record. In June of 2025, the band performed live for the first time in 4 decades. The performance took place in the region where the band had originally formed. The members who were available gathered on a small stage. Songs that had existed only on degraded cassette tape were played again, live, by the people who had written them. The community that had found them watched online and in person. It was not a large event by any commercial measure, but by almost any other measure, it was remarkable. 4 musicians playing songs they had written when they were young. The mystery had become a reunion. The community had become, in a very real sense, the reason a band existed again after 4 decades. This is not the normal relationship between listeners and musicians. Normally listeners come to music that already exists. Here a community had searched for music until they found both the recording and the people behind it, then collectively made the case for why it mattered. The musicians had been waiting without knowing they were waiting. There is a larger story here that this mystery illuminates. Every decade of recorded music contains countless recordings that were made but never properly archived. Regional acts, demo tapes, one-time radio performances by bands that dissolved before they had a chance to become historical. These recordings exist somewhere, on old tapes in attics, on cassettes in drawers, on reels in storage rooms. Most of them will never be found. Most of them are already lost. The magnetic tape that captured the song in the 1980s was never designed for permanence. It was designed for convenience, for affordability, for the ability to record and replay. The music that ended up on that tape was incidental to its purpose. It was not archived. It was not preserved. It was simply captured by accident of enthusiasm, by a teenager who liked the sound of something playing on the radio and pressed record before the song ended. Digital networks changed what was possible for lost recordings. The same systems that made it easy to forget content also made it possible to recover it. A community of tens of thousands could do what no individual could. Systematically eliminating possibilities, building and sharing expertise, reaching across languages and borders, contacting people who had not thought about their old band in decades. The internet had both created the obscurity and resolved it. The community that formed around the search did not set out to become a research institution. It formed because people were genuinely curious. That curiosity accumulated over years into something with real scholarly rigour. Documentation standards, verification protocols, systematic methodology. When the answer came, it was accepted and rejected according to those standards, not just celebrated. The community had taught itself how to do this kind of work, because the work mattered enough to get right. In northern Germany, a cassette tape survived long enough to be heard. That turned out to be everything. The story of the most mysterious song on the internet is, at its centre, a story about survival. Most of what was recorded on cassette tape in the 1980s is now gone. The iron oxide has shed, the tapes have broken, the bands have been forgotten in ways that feel permanent. This particular song was almost gone. Saved, it was a teenager who pressed record and a sister who cared enough to digitise an old tape before it was too late. There are probably thousands of similar mysteries still waiting in drawers and attics across the world. Songs played once, recorded by accident, never identified. Artists who made something real whose work survived but who have no way of knowing it. The most mysterious song on the internet was one of the fortunate ones. A community that found it was patient, rigorous, and lucky enough to look in the right place. The song still plays. It plays in streaming catalogues now, properly credited, with a note that tells the story. It plays in the memory of everyone who spent any time searching for it. It plays for people who heard it as a mystery and now hear it differently. As a completed thing, a question with an answer. The music that was almost lost is not lost anymore. If you have listened this far, you have heard the full arc of a mystery that lasted nearly 2 decades and ended in a small coastal city in 2025. The internet's capacity for patience, when curiosity runs deep enough, is one of its most underappreciated qualities. If you have ever wondered what other songs are still waiting to be found, that thought is worth carrying with you.